Sometimes eBay is best left well alone after dark. But it has left me with a really cool project to add to my expanding fantasy collection ready for the launch of Warhammer the Old World and to play 6th edition with my son. And I guess it also gives me an excuse to do something with this little bit of a sawn off tower that I've had knocking around in my scenery box for ages. Welcome to Miniature Realms, my name's Stuart and this episode of eBay Castle Rescue. Now I've always wanted one of these castles and we'll come to that later, but I'm going to blame this on Bretonnian Army Painter on Instagram. Do check out the Instagram if you haven't seen it already. Look at these fantastic pictures of the work he's done with the Mighty Fortress and the other work he's done on his armies and things as well. It's well worth checking out, so go and have a look. Now the first Siege rules came out in 1988 and I own this book right back when I started gaming with 3rd edition and I absolutely loved it. I daydream while flicking through the magazine at all the beautiful pictures of the big games, but I never played a game of Siege. I never had a castle big enough, and as much as I wanted the polystyrene Mighty Fortress, I never owned it. The book itself was absolutely rammed full of info. The first 90 pages or so were dedicated to fantasy, and bizarrely, the last chunk, 50 pages or so, were for 40k. Moving on a decade to 1998, and I was away at uni pretending I wasn't a geek and trying to chase the fairer sex. And in August that year, Games Workshop released Siege 2, which at the time went with 5th edition. A slightly slimmer book, this time just concentrating on the fantasy game and not having rules for sieges in 40k. Nonetheless, it was still a fantastic book written by Thomas Pirenham with help from Nigel Stillman. Loads of articles on how to build your own castles and siege equipment. Then to support that release, in August 1998, White Dwarf 224 was ram-packed full of siege articles. So there was a full battle report, there were some articles on how to build some extra siege equipment, and of course there was a beautiful double-page spread with a picture of the new plastic Mighty Fortress, as well as how to buy it in the back. I've got no doubt that this would have caused much excitement at the time, and as soon as I came back into gaming and found that the plastic castle existed, I've wanted one ever since. Now that wasn't the end to Siege rules. In the 6th edition rulebook there was a fairly hefty appendix, number 4, with all the Siege rules in there. And while it was only a few pages rather than a full book, there's a lot of text packed in there. It's pretty comprehensive. But as far as I'm aware, that was the last time we saw any official rules for Fantasy Siege. I wonder if we'll see anything for the Old World. So I won't lie, I am absolutely delighted to have this beast arrive in my collection. As much as it needs a little bit of work on it, I'm pretty sure that I can make it into something pretty cool. Probably nowhere near as nice as the Bretonnian Army Painters on Instagram, but still something that's a little bit of an upgrade from what you can see here. It's going to take some fixing up first, some bits need to be glued back together, there's a little bit of warping which I might not be able to do anything about. There's some gaps that definitely need to be filled as it wasn't built very well in the first place. And one of the doors hinges are broken, so I'm going to have to find some way to get that to fit back on, at least to stay on so it doesn't fall off during the game. But I think I'm going to have loads of fun trying to get this back on the table. So let's crack on with the rebuild then. So first of all I decided I wanted to work on those gaps and see if I could fill them. I started with milliput. It turned out it was going to be very faffy, especially with the sides moving around still. So I decided to whack loads of super glue in them and try and sort of re-brace them back in a slightly better shape. And where they wouldn't go back into shape, actually just fill it with a little bit of super glue and a bit of activator and then file it off afterwards. To smooth it off after that, I used some Vallejo plastic putty, which is a little bit like liquid green stuff really. It's like slightly better, I find it slightly easier to use. So I just shoved it in the gaps and smoothed it off with my fingers afterwards. Next up, I wanted to attack the door and see if I could find a way of putting the hinge back on. I actually drilled into the existing door on the side a little bit, just to have some holes of which to glue the new plastic brackets into, regardless of whether they were going to end up being new workable hinges or not. It would mean they're less likely to break off. So I superglued some parts of a plastic drink stirrer in. then cut them down to size so they would fit in and so the door could close. Now, I originally had it in mind to glue some supports the other side so the door would hinge and open, but the way the other door worked, it sort of clicked into place by lifting it slightly. I thought this was going to be a real faff. I may end up gluing the door shut, so I decided to opt for a different option, which was to glue a couple of struts on there and make a bar which would hold the whole door locked shut, as would have been used anyway, and also when it was in place it would stop the other door from falling off. A little bit of light scoring on the plastic stirrer to make it look like wood grain, and then it fitted nicely into place. So with the main castle all done, ready to spray, I went about building up a base for the little half tower I had knocking around for a few years. Now I've got a little bit of high density foam here left over from when my son had made some terrain of his own, didn't want it anymore, and rather than it going in the bin I thought I might be able to reuse it. So I drew around the edge of the tower so I knew where it needed to be placed, and proceeded to make the initial cuts with a hot cutting tool for foam. Very careful with these if you have them. This all got a little faffy and my proton isn't working at the moment, so I cut away with a knife. Then I decided to use a heat gun, which is something I had to do outside and couldn't film, but it's very, very good for kind of smoothing over areas and giving you shapes that you wouldn't be able to achieve just by cutting alone. So with the rock formation ready to go, as you can see where the heat gun has melted in, I deliberately went in really hard on one side. I wanted it to look like it was eroding away. I set about fixing the tower to the top. So I grabbed out the trusty hot glue gun and set about it. Once that was dry, I needed to work out how to make a pathway which led up to the door. There's actually two doors on it. I'm going to use a ladder on the other side, but I found these bits left over from a spare Lord of the Rings toy, which was a Bridge of Khazad-dûm display model. Now I decided that I could hot glue in the first part of this because it seemed to fit almost perfectly on the rock formation that I had ahead. There was absolutely no planning ahead involved in this. And then by luck, some other parts of the same toy, which I'd also used before for some terrain, seemed to match up perfectly. I just had to align them in place, glue them together, and fill some of the gaps in with milliput. Now I'll leave these two parts separate so they could be stored easily, but as you can see we now have a stairway leading up to the observer tower, which will sit separate from the castle. So after I've hit everything with a black primer, I set about cracking out the airbrush, and this is German grey. Now I've designed all the processes in this video that if you wanted to follow them at home, you could do so without an airbrush as well. So for this stage there'll be lots of dry brushing or over brushing probably. Now you want to make sure you've got a pretty large brush or it will take you a very, very long time. The large makeup style ones are absolutely perfect, and what you want to do is make sure you've got a little bit more paint left on your brush than you would normally for a standard dry brush, and maybe go in one direction, so top to bottom along those bricks, making sure that you're leaving some of the black in the crevices. And once I've done this on all sections of the model, I moved on to London Grey and pretty much followed the same system here. So airbrushing mainly from a top down angle at a funny angle into the walls, and then I did concentrate the lighter areas on the doors and towards the lower ends of the towers. I wanted to make sure that the overhang on the tower looked like some shadow. Again, if you are dry brushing this, go a little bit lighter this time. You don't want to completely obliterate the original German grey. And then onto the final grey with the airbrush. This is light grey again. These are all from Model Colour from Vallejo. This time I'm just making sure that again I leave the previous two colours showing slightly, so I'm almost working up from the bottom here, so I want to concentrate the light a little bit more, focused on the doors and around the archways, on the edges of the buildings and on the tops of the parapets. And this is the kind of overall effect you get after doing those 3 stages of airbrushing over the black. You'll notice there's a little bit of shadow behind each of the higher areas of the walls on the ramparts there. The tower again, very, very similar. Little bit of extra focus on the doors, on the edges and towards the bottom. Now it's time for some dry brushing white grey. Obviously, if you've been dry brushing all along, this will make no difference to you. But if it's the first time, use a large brush as you possibly can. This is a makeup brush. I don't know the type. Makeup users might be able to help you if you aren't a makeup user yourself. But I'm trying to dry brush mostly in circular motions, if not top down in the direction of the building. I'm just picking up as much of the detail as I can, but not so thick that I get any of the streaking. So it might really tickling it here. It's very hard to see on the camera how much pressure I'm putting on, but these bristles are very, very soft. Lots of circular motions, and you find all that detail comes out really nicely. Same process completely on all the wall parts as well. And this is the effect you get from those 3 stages of grey airbrushing and 1 stage of white grey dry brushing. And you could pop this on the table right now, even without the details added, and it will look a lot better than it did when I first picked it up. And some people may not want to go on and do all the next stages with all the extra shadow and weathering and things, and just fancy painting in the doors. And again, you'll have a fantastic looking castle if you do. But I'm going to carry on, and we have some Garagak Zua here, and I'm going to be painting in all of the wooden areas. So essentially we're talking the doors and hatchways. Now the dry brushing stage I did here with the white is really important because it's picked out all of that wood grain detail. And when doing a smooth coat of this Garagak Zua contrast paint, it picks out all of that detail for you, and you don't have to go back and do a dry brush or so afterwards. It's already showing that detail in the same way as it would if you painted a flat brown colour and went and dry brushed afterwards. I used exactly the same process on the main doors, taking my time and trying to make sure I didn't get any on this stonework. So for the metal areas, we're talking the straps on the doors, the handles and locks and hinges and things. I'm using thrash metal from Scale Colour, which is scale 75. This is a slightly duller, more desaturated metallic colour, and I wanted it to look a little bit sort of old and worn rather than bright and shiny, and this seemed perfect. I just methodically worked my way around each tower at a time, doing both doors and each hatch that are on each tower, not forgetting to work on the front door itself, where you've got all these studs on the front and then more studs and some strapping on the back. Now to shade the metal, I'm actually using some Scale Colour soil wash, which is a ready mixed oil wash, and this is grease. You could use an Agrak Thirst shade for this, or a non-oil, whatever you prefer. I like the oil wash because it doesn't pool and it gives a nice little effect where it spills over afterwards. And because it was an oil wash, I decided to add that spillover to the frames around the doors, deliberately putting it in the crevices in between the sort of stone and just letting it spread out a little bit. As you can see, where people have used the doorways a lot, that area has picked up some dirt and grime. Now from one grime over to rattling grime. This is contrast paint from Citadel. Now I'm cracking out the airbrush here again. Now for those of you that are following along or trying to use these techniques on something else and want to do it without an airbrush, if you thin this paint slightly, still apply it into the crevices here, you should be able to get a similar effect by, with a clean brush, feathering it out and just basically using it as a shade. You'll see here that I'm adding it into all of the crevices and corners and basically shading the model and also weathering it at the same time. So not only does it add some shadow in, it also looks like ground in dirt, and it's just such a quick way of doing it if you are able to do it with an airbrush. It will take you a lot longer if you haven't got an airbrush, but painting something of this size will take you a long time anyway if you don't have an airbrush. But I think this effect is really, really pleasing. Now after I've done the tops of the towers, I'm adding it in underneath the lintel here, or whatever you want to call that, just where the shadow is, and then running lines down the sides of the building, allowing that sort of one set of stones to be slightly more accentuated. And you'll see here that I'm also using it to paint some streaks of grime as if they were running down the building. So again, this paint doing that dual effect of adding shadow but also building up some grime and wear and tear. Use the same colour to add in some shadow and grime on the steps leading up to that separate tower. adding the same colour to the tower itself and the rest of the walkway, including some of the rocks underneath. Then using exactly the same method on all of the wall sections as well. Don't forget that when you do the rear side of the wall, there are parts that would be more shadowed than others. I built this in initially with the airbrushing of the grey, but you can see me reinforcing that colour here now with the grime. You'll also notice me picking out the odd brick so it stands out as a slightly different colour. The section of wall over the main gate is a little bit more complicated, but the same processes all apply. You just have to work out where the extra grime and shadow will go. I made sure that I added the same shadows that I did on the edges of the building around the main flagstones, around the arch of the main gate. But essentially all of the same processes apply for all of the wall and tower sections. Now, going back to the trusty contrast Garagax sewer, I'm going to use this to add some dirt to the bottom of the building all the way around. It's a slightly different colour to the grime. I wanted it to look a bit more brown, as if it was earth that had been worked up from the ground around it. And I'm also using it at the same time to pick out the odd brick of a different colour. Again, follow exactly the same processes on the wall sections as you do with the towers. And then I use the same colour quite extensively on the rock areas, including some contrast Militarum green as well. Getting close to the end now, cracked out some Creed camo contrast, again just to add a little bit of variance. I'm not doing anywhere near as much as I did with the grime, but just giving some subtle areas of green so it looks a little bit like some moss or some staining on the brickwork. As before, make sure you follow this all around the castle itself. And finishing off with the airbrush with some contrast skeleton horde. This is a slightly lighter colour, again to add a little bit of variation, but I'm focusing this on the top of the ramparts themselves. Some of the dry brushing is a little bit bright there, so this acts as a little bit of a glaze. And again, I can go around and pick out the odd flagstone in different colours. Just adding that subtle lighter tone, I think, just really breaks up the existing colours that we've got and adds that bit of variation and makes it look a little bit more realistic. Of course, as before, if you're not using an airbrush, you can pick all of these out using this thin down with a standard hairy brush, and especially when it comes to picking out the individual stones. And there we have the final effect on the stonework itself. All essentially glazes and dry brushing and a bit of airbrushing. I think I'm pretty happy with the way it's come out there. I think it looks pretty grim and well used, and definitely very fitting for a fantasy setting. But of course, we're not quite done yet. We've still got that little weird rocky outcrop with a smaller tower on. So in order to get it to blend into gaming tables a little bit better, I added some mud effect to the bottom of the base. Then I grabbed out a whole host of different coloured tufts and flowers and things. I like the idea of different grasses growing up between the rocks. Some grass maybe growing on the top areas and things. Maybe some birds have been nesting. Anything really to help it stopping it look quite so dull and grey and make it blend better into any wargaming table it sits on. And as you can see, I think it has quite a transformative effect on the base of that separate tower. And this will probably get more use than the main castle, because I imagine it will quite often sit on part of a regular gaming table for a standard battle. And that's it. Now, I really enjoyed doing this. As I said at the top of the video, I've been wanting to own a Games Workshop castle since I was probably 12 years old. Now, I never got hold of that initial polystyrene Mighty Fortress, but this plastic one is absolutely brilliant. Now, I'm pretty sure that there are other plastic castles out there on the market. I know Renedra make a really fantastic one, and there's some really, really good 3D printed options out there. But I really wanted to scratch that nostalgia itch and pick up something that I wasn't able to own as a child. And it's been fun rescuing it and sort of giving it a new lease of life, and it will be fun to get it on the table and play some siege games once I have my armies painted. And even if the old world doesn't have any siege rules, well, I've got 3 editions worth of siege rules that I can cannibalize and get to work on the table. Let's face it, if you're playing a siege game, you're not really doing it with a match play mindset. It's much more about the fun that you can have and the stories that you can create on the tabletop. So let me know what you think. I'm going to be on the lookout maybe for the odd tower or 2 that I can rescue, maybe an extra wall section so I can change the layout, but I quite like the idea of cannibalizing a couple of towers into a bit of a keep and maybe another wall section that I can build something onto. I like it that it's modular and generic at the moment, and I feel like I could put an Empire army or a Bretonnian army in it, but I also like the idea of picking up the odd extra little bit and building something on those to make them more for the armies that I'm collecting. So I swap out a tower and it becomes the Bretonnians castle, I swap out a tower and a wall and it becomes the Empire one. You get the idea, I think. So let me know what you think. It's been a super fun video to do, and if you've enjoyed the video, please do give us a like, and if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to the channel. Check out all the other videos that are there, plenty of fantasy stroke old world related topics. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, take care, and I'll catch you soon.